So this is not what it's not my opinion. But these were the first words that I heard from friends in Kashmir about 10 years ago. This was in 2002. My first visit. And these young Kashmiri boys. So this is what I was sort of welcomed with over there. And so these were very young, irate Kashmiri lads, about say 22 to 25 years old. And they were very angry. So they were very angry at, firstly, the Indian government and the Indian army for what they were doing to them, kind of harassment that they were being subjected to over there. They were very angry at the political legacy that had been left behind for them, that they had to deal with. And thirdly, they were very angry at themselves because they had no idea what to do. They had no solutions. And I was completely like out of my league over there, out of sight, because these guys were very, very politically aware. Young boys, 22 to 25, but extremely politically aware, knowing exactly what's going on around, and be able to discuss politics really in depth. And I was also fairly young, maybe about 25, and I had no clue what was going on. And yet, the very first words that I was sort of exposed to over there was, "We hate India." And it became very difficult for me because I had to sort of take the brunt of those words, and sort of that was what it was just thrown at me. A good friend of mine today, but at the time we were just meeting for the first time. And so if I had any sort of idea or thought that this is going to be a vacation in Kashmir, it's going to be a pretty chilled out time that I'm going to have over there, that was thrown out the window right away. Because my Kashmiri friends didn't let go very easily. So for the next 8 or 9 days that I spent over there, they challenged me on every count. So they questioned me hugely, and they kept questioning me about India's policy towards Kashmir, for example. Or they challenged me with my belief systems. What were my assumptions about Kashmir or about Kashmiris? And they kept sort of provoking me with their hatred of India. And so that was something really difficult for me to deal with in the first few days. They even took me out on a hartal. So every Friday they have this strike over there, and generally turns out to be pretty violent. And this was way back in 2002. So suddenly I find myself in a car with a bunch of guys, and being chased around with by a bunch of other guys with hockey sticks and cricket bats and all that. And so that's my second day in Kashmir, and we're sort of driving around and running around. Then we had long discussions in the night about things like the Public Safety Act or the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. So these are draconian laws that are being enforced in Kashmir. And so day 1, we hate India. Day 2, go out into a hartal and deal with angry mobs over there. Day 3, I'm being told about the Public Safety Act, an act where they can arrest somebody for 2 years without any charges being needed to be filed. So they can just throw somebody into prison and not tell them why he's in prison. And it's done all the time over there. And then the next thing was the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, where Indian soldiers can shoot people on sight, and they don't have to justify why they did so. This is just on the mere suspicion that somebody is a terrorist. So these were the first 3 days of my experience in Kashmir. But moving back to where we are sort of, so you can see the anger over there. This is what I was experiencing over there on day 2. Mobs over there throwing stones, beating up people, whatever. And so my first reaction, coming back to the statement, "We hate India," was complete outrage. I was an Indian visiting Kashmir for the first time, and I had always thought of it as being part of India. That's what I'd been told all the time. And here I was suddenly having to face these bunch of guys who said that we hate India. So the first reaction was complete outrage. And I wanted to react. I wanted to fight back, I wanted to defend, I wanted to shout at them. But these were also friends, I was staying with them. I was young, I didn't know any politics. And soon enough, this next emotion kicked in, which was fear. Because for the first time in my life, I was in a place which was completely alien to me. Culturally, the religion was different. So I'm a Hindu. So I'm from a country where the majority of us are Hindu. But suddenly I was thrown into a place where, say, about 95% of people are Muslims. and many of them were very angry. And me being Indian, I sort of also was a representative of the rest of India because there wasn't any tourism going on at the time. Not many Indians visiting the place. It was mostly curfew. After 4 every day it was curfew. And suddenly I'm in this place staying with Kashmiri Muslim boys and who were very sort of angry and hostile. Not with me, but generally like very angry, full of anger. And I'm sort of having to deal with all of this. So now I couldn't do anything about it. I wanted to say something, I wanted to defend my country and all of that. And it just wasn't happening. And then I took one decision at that point in time, that because I'm not able to react in anger, because I'm not able to sort of talk about what's on my mind or defend my country or whatever, I had to do something else. I had to try and figure out why exactly they were so angry. And I had to sort of figure out a way to communicate with them and talk to them about it. And while I was thinking about all of this, I was pondering over all of this, something I'd read in a book a few months ago came to my mind. So this is a book by Shashi Tharoor, incidentally. It's a book called India from Midnight to Millennium. And the book by itself is a fairly interesting read, post-independence India. But there were these 2 pages where he described something about identity which suddenly popped up in my mind. Because a lot of the discussions we were having at that point was about identity, nationality, things like that. And for me, primarily because I was accustomed to calling Kashmiris Indians. And here they were laughing at me when I would say something like that. They would think of it as an absurd notion, and keep declaring that they hate India. And they would say things like, "Aap India se aaye hain, so you have come from India, so you're like welcome to our country." And I would be, no, this is also the same country. This is India. And they would laugh. All of them, like 5 of them, would laugh, and I would be really like angry. And so suddenly this thought occurred to me after reading. These 2 pages that I read came back to me. So what Shashi Tharoor basically pointed out in those 2 pages was the sense of multiple identities. And as a young person, 25 years old, I hadn't really given it much thought at all. Now suddenly this idea popped up that why am I feeling so angry? The reason I was feeling so angry is because I was defending my Indianness. And I felt compelled to do something like that. Then I realized I was not just Indian. Simultaneously, I was also Asian, right? Not just Asian, but I was also South Indian. Male, musician, thin, Hindu, whatever. I'm in the category of people who wear specs. I'm in the height range of 5'5" to 5'10". So any of these could be my identity. So why the hell am I choosing Indianness as my dominant identity? So it's just because I was told that you're Indian and you need to sort of feel proud about it and be patriotic or whatever it is. Well-intentioned people right from childhood, we keep hearing these things. And these were the things that kept coming into my mind. And then when I realized that I didn't have to only choose Indianness as my dominant identity, I could actually choose one of these others, any of these others. I could, like, right now, if you have the inclination and I have the time, I could sort of go on, name 40 different identities that I'm made of. So at that point in time, I just made one conscious choice that if I need to be able to talk to my friends and have some sort of a discussion with them about these issues, I need to let go of my Indianness temporarily. And it was difficult because the tendency to react or defend was very, very strong. But I chose a wider identity for the time being. Temporarily, I chose that, okay, I'm a human being, I'm a global citizen. Can I just adopt that? And can I learn to listen to these people? Perhaps, if I think of myself as a global citizen and not as an Indian, I might be able to listen to what they're trying to say. And almost instantly, my demeanor changed. My sort of desire to convert them into, sort of thinking in my way, or my desire to defend, all that sort of just faded away. And suddenly I was this person who was able to listen to these young Kashmiri boys. And we were able to have some really nice conversations after that. Really nice discussions, as you saw. It was Kashmir University, so we would sit like this for hours and hours and chat about all sorts of things. And so for me, that was the beginning of this sort of seed of an idea that I'd had of what is currently Journeys with Meaning. So Journeys with Meaning is what I do now. It's a sort of firm that I run, and we operate trips, we offer trips around the country, but primarily with the idea of opening up discussions about all kinds of issues. And for me, travel is one of the primary ways of doing it. Because I used to do workshops earlier on similar themes. But the thing is, when you do a workshop, you're sitting in a room with, say, 20 other people, maybe over 2 or 3 days. And we have some great conversations, we watch films, we sort of, engage with each other and all of that. But in the evening, we go back home. And then we go back to our daily routines and daily life, and we forget about what's happened. But when you're on a trip like this, when you're actually spending, say, about 10 or 15 days traveling with a bunch of people, meeting organizations, meeting people, engaging over there, the kind of impact that it has is tremendous. So, for example, I don't have to talk about, what's happening in Kashmir. I take them there, and we straight away go into the, city when there's a curfew going on, or when there's a crackdown happening, say, for example. Or sometimes nothing is happening, it's great, Srinagar is fantastic, we're having a ball of a time, walking around, eating food, whatever. And then suddenly somebody comes running and saying crackdown, crackdown, and everybody runs. And like my advice to my group is always, if you see the locals running, go for it, run as fast as you can. Don't even waste time thinking about what's happening. So thankfully we've not had to do this, running for our lives, but just being there is enough. So the bunch of people who came with me on the very first Kashmir trip, for example, in 2007, we just got there, and on day 2 we just went out for a walk, and we see this little park, and a bunch of people sitting there, sort of protesting about something. We had no idea what was going on. We just walked in and we asked one of them, so what's going on? And a lady says that this is a protest meeting that we hold on the 10th of every month. It's an association of parents of disappeared persons, and there are about 80,000 people missing in Kashmir. Nobody knows what's happened to them. So, we just went and sat with them, spoke with them. We met a 17-year-old girl who sort of shared her story. Her father had gone missing. He was picked up by an army regiment 5 years before that. And they know which prison he was sent to, they know sort of who picked him up and all of that. But absolutely no respite for them. They don't know what's up with him. Like, is he alive? Is he dead? Is he still in prison? No news. 5 years. She was 14 when he was picked up, and she was 19 when we met her. So that's the kind of story that we sort of experienced over there. We didn't have to sort of read about it or think about it. These are people telling us the stories. This is what's happening over there. So, journeys with meaning. So what exactly, what are the other things that sort of propel us or compel us to, do the kind of trips that we do? So the Kashmir story I've just told you, it's primarily about the sort of politics of the place. And for me, what's interesting is the whole social side. Like, here are the people we like to claim as our own. So we keep on saying that Kashmir is an integral part of India. And yet, when Kashmiris want to talk about it, nobody wants to listen to them. Right? Or even if we do go and listen to them, we end up arguing with them about what we think is right or wrong or whatever. We don't listen, we argue. That's what we do. Including people in my group. So that happens. In fact, we deliberately go sit in the university, get a bunch of students from Kashmir University talk to us. And before you know it, there's a heated debate going on, and I have to sort of, cut it short, otherwise there'll be a mini riot or something like that. So we just have to do that. But some of the other things that we're interested in, I'm very, very interested in environment. And that's also a big concern. So one of the things that we deal with a lot is kind of priorities that a lot of people have these days. So as you can see from the cartoon, all sorts of stuff going on. There's holes in the ozone layer, and there's icebergs melting all over, and there's entire ecosystems disappearing. But what we're really concerned about is how expensive our petrol is now. That's what we're bothered about. And nobody gives a damn about what's going on really. For the large part. Not that people don't care, but how much are we acting on it? So this is one big reason, the kind of priorities that people have, which I'd like to address. The other is denial, or being overly optimistic about how things are turning out to be. So, as you can see, like, the world is sort of completely polluted and getting worse, and yet there are people sort of going on and on about how things are actually, perfectly fine and getting better, business as usual. And while I'm not against business or anything of the kind, I'd also like to sort of explore what's going on over there, what's really happening. And the third thing that we face really is a lot of young people who are very, very confused about what they want to do with their lives. So often they come on the trip and so we're sort of trying to deal with this aspect that a lot of people are just trying to pay the rent and hating what they do. So we're trying to get more and more of them to start thinking about what is it that you love doing and why aren't you doing it. So dive right in and start doing it. So thankfully for me, these trips are like to very remote regions for 10, 15 days at a stretch. So I have a captive audience, they can't run away anywhere. And they have to sort of listen to me and they stay with me for like 15 days. So there's some hardcore like persuasion or whatever happened over there. So a bit more about what we do is, one is like challenging assumptions and belief systems that people might be carrying around with them. Again, it's just the result of social conditioning. You read about it, talk about it, parents tell you about it, your teachers tell you about it. And we just treat it as the truth. And so one of the things that we do is to sort of challenge assumptions and belief systems that about all kinds of things that people might be having in their minds. The second thing is to expose people to responsible travel. So the idea that if you are traveling, there are ways in which you can do it. And one is not saying that, okay, this is a wrong way, that's a right way. But for me, when I'm thinking about travel, I always think of it in terms of how can we have the least possible impact on the planet. What is it that we can do to sort of make sure that we are not damaging the planet much. So, for example, we get our participants to travel by road and train as much as possible. So I do this by making them feel guilty about flying. By saying that, okay, like for each trip that you've had, like a flight from Bombay to Delhi, for example, would generate something like 250 kilograms of carbon dioxide per person. And in order to be able to sort of offset that, you will need to plant something like 20 fully grown trees. 20 fully grown trees are needed to take in that CO2 and convert it into oxygen. And obviously you're not going to be planting 20 fully grown trees. You're going to be just planting some saplings, if at all you do, which you don't even bother. So sometimes this sort of works with people, and they feel guilty for a while and work on this. But I'm still trying to work out the more sustainable solution. So that would involve something like tying up with an NGO, in the places that we visit, and maybe do a plantation drive while we're there. So that way we can also get to talk about local flora and fauna and what are the kinds of trees that grow there. So that way we are sort of engaging with this idea in a deeper way. And it's not just a guilt trip. And the third thing we're trying to do is to build long-term relationships with various communities around. So the people that we visit and spend time with and talk to, we are trying to now develop these 3-4 month long projects where the people who come on our trips can then spend more time working on these, So for example, we visit a school called Sekmol in Ladakh. For those of you who've seen Three Idiots, that's the school that is sort of, it was shot at. It wasn't shot there, it was shot in another school, but the idea was based on Sekmol. So we visit Sekmol and we spend about, a couple of days over there talking to people. Now a lot of the people who come on my trips want to go back and work there. So we're trying to now tie it up in such a way that they can go back and volunteer for 3 months or something like that. Or in Meghalaya. So, for example, we visit Meghalaya for 10 days and we see some pristine forests over there, some, fantastic, the last sort of reserves of nature that really in India now. And a lot of people again want to do something about it. So, trying to work out some sort of a project where they can go back, stay there for 6 months and work on it. And maybe contribute to local organizations while they're doing this. And for me, it's always been, in fact, I don't even call this travel related stuff. For me, it's a workshop. It's less about traveling and more about workshop. So how I look at it is, the travel is just something that needs to happen for the workshop bit to actually, be impactful. So if I was doing this in a room, it's not going to work as much. But if I take them to a glacier that's melting, and then we talk about it, or we talk to an 80-year-old from Ladakh who's seen the glaciers in his childhood, and who says, okay, at that time it used to be really much better, and it's anecdotal. I don't have any scientific data. In fact, India doesn't have much scientific data about it. But even anecdotal evidence plays a big role. The stories that we hear over there. So those are the kind of things that we've been trying to do. Journeys with meaning. And this is something that I really very strongly believe, that there are no unsacred places. So the whole earth really is one big sacred place, and we have just been desecrating it. So that's really what's been happening, and the process is continuing. And so what I'm trying to do is use those 10 days to get people to start thinking about how they're contributing to the desiccation. It's not like you're all wantonly doing it and we're going out and polluting, but just by living the lifestyles that we do, we're contributing to it. So for example, I flew in today. Now, it could have been avoided perhaps. And so when I think about that, like this year I've flown to Delhi maybe 4 or 5 times. That means I'll need to plant about 100 fully grown trees just to offset my carbon offsets, just my carbon emissions. Or think about the kind of water that we use. So these are the kind of things that I talk about. Like I ask, do any of you know how much you're paying for your water out here in Delhi? How much do you pay for the water that you receive at home? Any idea?
120 rupees per month.
120 rupees per month.
Yeah.
That's for a whole family.
Yeah.
And we consume several thousand liters. Now, if you were to pay the market rate for it, like you go and buy a bottle of Bisleri, it would be about 15 to 18 rupees. So you pay 18 rupees or 15 rupees for 1 liter of water. But on the other hand, you get water at home, several thousand liters in a month for 120 rupees. How seriously are we going to take it? And it's not even about money. I'm just saying that we don't even care two hoots about it. We don't even know something like this. So it's fine if we leave the taps running. It's fine if we just use the flush each time we have to use the loo or something like that. Come to Ladakh, it's a dry desert environment. There is water only for 4 months in a year when the streams melt, glaciers melt and the streams start flowing. So those 4-5 months in a year you have running water. That's the water you get. And suddenly you have this huge influx of tourists, like about 1 lakh people getting into Ladakh. And since all of us are so accustomed to using, the sort of the kind of toilets that we have in the city, we want it over there too. We can't use Indian-style squatting toilets or the dry toilet system that the Ladakhis use. But they have a fantastic system. They have a little, 2-story structure. Go into the first floor, there's a little hole in the ground over there. Do your job through it and put sand on it, not water. They have huge amounts of sand all over. So just take sand and put it all there, and it's covered up, no odor, no nothing. And after a year, it becomes fertilizer for your fields. It's completely decomposed, all the bacteria, whatever is gone. Take it and spread it in your fields, and you've got free fertilizer. Instead, what we make them do is we say, okay, listen, I want to stay in your guest house, but I can't use this toilet, so please give me a flush tank and all of that. And 25 liters each time you flush, or 21 liters, whatever it is, each time you flush. So if I take a group of 15 people and we go to the toilet twice a day, that's per person we're spending about, you're using up about 40 to 50 liters in one day. And that's multiplied by 15. But if we were to use the Ladakhi toilet system, you just have to carry a bottle of water with you to wash up, or toilet paper, whatever your rocks are about. Do that. And so 15 people using the same toilet with 1 liter of water, it's 15 liters. So see the difference that comes up over there. But these are not things that we think about otherwise, back in the city. So these are the kind of things that we talk about over there, literally toilets and excreta and stuff. But hopefully that changes something in people's mind. It's an interesting quote that I came up, again, an article by Shashi Tharoor. So he and I seem to have some sort of affinity. He makes me think clearly, since I've been quoting from him twice today already. But very interesting point that he makes is that travel does different things to different people. So for some, like Mahatma Gandhi or Darwin, it provides reasons to sort of study the world or to connect with other people and understand the world in a different way, in a more positive way. And then you had other people who used it to cause great destruction and great harm. But like he says, most of us fall somewhere in between these two polarities. We are not Mahatma Gandhi, we are not Pol Pot either. But it makes us reevaluate everything that we see around us. If we do it with that spirit, of course. So the idea is we can just go on a trip, have great fun and come back. But if we go with the spirit of somebody who wants to sort of know what's going on, then it forces us to reevaluate everything that we see around us. It forces us to ask difficult questions of ourselves. So are we just going to come back and get back to our lifestyles, or are we going to start thinking about it and see what we can do differently? And for me, the last sentence is very, very interesting. Travel, in other words, is learning by other means. Because I'm somebody who's really, really fond of informal learning. So, I've walked out of college and done stuff like that. So, like, for me, travel's been my textbook. Every time I travel and meet organizations, meet people, I've learned so much about the world. So, and this is what I want to leave you with, that this is what I hope to do with Journeys with Meaning. That when asked if I'm pessimistic or optimistic about my future, my answer is always the same. That if you look at the science, what we have today, and you see what's happening on Earth, and if you're not pessimistic about it, then you could, I mean, basically either we don't understand the data or we're in denial about something. But if you meet the people who are working on all these issues, people who are doing absolutely fantastic things around the country and around the world, then you can't help but be optimistic. And so that's what I'm trying to do, because a lot of people are very, very cynical and jaded and angry, but don't know how to sort of deal with it. So when we meet people like Chewang Norfil, who's designed artificial glaciers in Ladakh, and he's a 76-year-old man, and he's designed these fantastic artificial glaciers, which gives an additional 2 months of water to the villages, so they can grow an extra crop, which is a huge deal for them. So he's done that. You meet him and talk to him, you see, so there's so much more possible. Post-retirement, he's 76, and he's doing that. Or you meet somebody like, the person who started SecMol, Sonam Wangchuk, and you just see how much effort he's put in to set up that incredible campus. It's a campus built entirely out of mud, out of rammed earth, and he's designed it using most intelligent sort of sustainable engineering techniques. And you go there and see it, and you wonder why aren't the rest of us doing this? It's completely inexpensive, and it's bordering on genius. I mean, like the kind of designs that he's coming up with. But nobody cares again. But when you meet him, talk to him, then something changes. Or you go to a living root bridge in Meghalaya. I don't know how many of you have heard of it, but I'm sure you have. But it's a system that the Khasi villagers have done, where they build bridges across their rivers, swollen rivers and streams, which are made of the roots of trees. So imagine their patience. They actually plant 2 trees, rubber trees, on either side of the bank, of the river bank. And then for the next 40 years, the village sort of contributes in shaping the roots and getting them entangled and all of that. And there's a family of, each village has its own family who does that. And they keep passing on this tradition. So if you go to Meghalaya today, you will find living root bridges which are 300 years old. And they're sturdier than before because they've just grown stronger. And there's a double-decker bridge. Just for fun, they've built a double-decker bridge. As if this isn't enough. So there are like 50 people can stand on that, lower level and upper level, and perfectly capable of walking over there. And that's the kind of genius that we have in this country, and that's the kind of genius we can learn from. So I'll leave you with this thought. Thank you. Questions right now? Questions?
Yeah,
Is it right
if
now?
anybody has a question.
What I was talking about was from
I know it
2002.
isn't really, you're talking about travel, but since Kashmir is...
Yeah, the basic situation remains unchanged. There's still the sort of largest sort of militarization, it's the largest sort of militarized zone in the world. I think we have about 7 lakh soldiers there for a population of 12 lakh in Srinagar city, a little more than that, not 12 lakh, a little more. But 7 lakh soldiers. Now the deal is that these are people, if we claim that Kashmir is India, they should be standing on the border looking out, away from India, protecting India's borders. But in Kashmir it's the other way around, they're all looking in, at the Kashmiris, with guns and bunkers, all of that.
But this is like whose viewpoint?
I mean, again, it's just something you have to go and experience. So I'm not saying the Indian Army is wrong or bad. I'm not saying the Kashmiris are right. I'm just saying that this is what it is.
One question I wanted to ask was, when you said that you've gone there and certain groups of yours go there, that there's a problem of acceptability because of identity.
Yeah.
Okay. They're not willing to accept another point of view, the Kashmiri point of view. Likewise, when you're interacting with them,
They have the same problem.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's what I want to
The
point out.
misconceptions exist on both
It
sides.
might lead to a riot or something. So
Very
wouldn't
much,
it be
right?
the other way around? That they are not willing to accept anything.
It's both ways. As in, both sides have grown up being conditioned. So let's take, for example, the average Kashmiri youngster today, say who's about 25 or 30. So between 1988, 87 when the violence started, till about, for 20 years, there was no tourism, nothing was happening. So they were locked up in this valley. Very few of them were able to get out and study and things like that. So those, they are the lucky ones who moved to Pune or Delhi or Bangalore to study. The rest of them were just stuck over there. and they couldn't get to talk to Indians, other Indians, like say for somebody like me or somebody like you, they couldn't talk to us. So they believed what they were told as well, by their religious leaders or their community people or whatever, whoever says, right? And they have as much misconception as we do. And that's the problem, that when two people are reacting to images of each other, not the actual person, we are actually just reacting to some image that we have created in our mind. How can you have a dialogue? How can we talk about peace? How can we sort of, move forward from there? We aren't even able to listen to each other. So like there's a song by Extreme, this rock band called Extreme. It says 3 sides to every story. Yours, mine and your truth. So we first deal with yours and mine, we sort of thrash it out, debate, argue, whatever, and then hopefully there's this little bit of silence that emerges from all that anger and frustration, where we quieten down, we get tired of shouting at each other, and then we can listen to each other. So that's really my hope for Kashmir or for any other place.